"Please, don't lift my skirt," she begged, but the millionaire rancher did. The voice was no louder than a breeze, rasped, trembling, and barely alive, but it stopped him cold. Caleb Whitaker knelt in the dim light of the ruined barn, his gloved hand frozen at the hem of her torn dress. The woman's skin was streaked with blood and filth, her body tangled in coarse ropes, her breath too shallow to trust. Her one good eye, glassy with pain, didn't flinch from him. But her words weren't about modesty. They were about something else entirely. "Please," she had whispered, "don't lift my skirt." But he did, not because he wanted to, because he had to, because he saw the blood, because he'd seen that kind of damage before, because he knew when a wound would kill faster than silence. And when he peeled back the hem, just enough to see the truth, his jaw clenched. There it was, seared into the raw flesh of her upper thigh. Property of M. Reeve. The letters were jagged, fresh, burned deep, not carved by impulse, but by intention. Caleb flinched, nearly dropped the skirt, and swallowed against the bile rising in his throat. The name hit him like a bullet, not because he didn't know it, but because he did. Malcolm Reeve. The man had once shaken Caleb's hand across a land deal, had smiled with polished teeth and said, "God bless the workin' man." But now Caleb saw the truth of what kind of empire Reeve had built. One burned into flesh, branded like cattle. The woman didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She just waited. Waiting to see if this man, this stranger, would turn and leave her here like trash, just another secret left to die in the Wyoming heat. He didn't. Caleb lowered her skirt slowly, reverently, as though covering a grave. "I'm getting you out of here," he muttered, more to himself than her. He took out his knife, careful not to make sudden movements. The ropes were tight, soaked in sweat and blood. She flinched once as he cut through, but said nothing more. She didn't need to, because somewhere in her silence he heard it, the surrender. The kind that only came when a soul had been hunted long enough to stop believing in rescue. But Caleb wasn't a lawman. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a hero. He was a widower with too much whiskey in his blood and too many ghosts in his barn. Still, he couldn't leave her. Not like this. He wrapped her in his saddle blanket, lifted her in both arms. She was too light, too quiet. The horse spooked at the smell of blood, but Caleb soothed it with a touch. And then he turned south, toward the only place he had left, home. The land stretched quiet and scorched beneath a white-hot sky. Sagebrush cracked under hoof. Pines leaned away from the sun. And somewhere behind him, that broken barn stood like a silent witness. What Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this woman, this battered, near-dead stranger, was about to pull him into a war far older, far deeper than either of them imagined. A war written in ink and land and blood. A war Reeve had always won, until now. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and yarrow. Outside, the mountain sat heavy against the sky, pale blue and stubborn. Inside, time moved slow. Caleb Whitaker had lived alone too long to notice the quiet, but now, with someone else breathing beneath his roof, he heard it in every corner. The girl, no, the woman, slept in his bed. The same one Clara had once warmed with restless limbs and whispered dreams. Caleb had stripped the linens, washed them in boiling water, and burned the old blanket. Still, something lingered. Eleanor, though he didn't yet know her name, had not spoken since the barn. She slept much of the first 2 days. When she did wake, her eyes stayed unfocused, and her body flinched at the creak of floorboards or the wind catching the shutters.
She took broth in small sips. He spooned it to her slowly, not looking her in the eye unless she looked first. She rarely did. Her wounds festered by the second morning. Caleb had seen infection before, on men who'd lived too long with bullets in them, on calves caught in barbed wire. He recognized the color, the smell. He brewed a paste of yarrow and pine ash, crushed between two smooth stones and wrapped in boiled cloth. As he worked, he glanced now and then at the pale woman in his bed, watching her chest rise and fall, thin as paper. He didn't pray out loud, but somewhere between grinding and boiling, his thoughts turned toward heaven. When he knelt to dress her wounds, he was careful, hands firm but gentle. He spoke little, only what needed saying.
"This'll burn," he said once, laying the cloth along her thigh, careful not to let his eyes linger where the scar burned red and raw. "But it'll help." She didn't answer. Her hand gripped the blanket, knuckles pale. But she didn't cry out. Caleb admired that, in a quiet way. He tried not to think of Clara, but it was impossible. The way this woman curled into herself at night reminded him of those final months, when Clara had become something smaller, quieter, fading by inches before the fever took her. This woman, though, she was still fighting, even in her silence. On the third night, as the wind moaned low against the logs, he caught a whisper. "It doesn't hurt as much today." Caleb froze halfway through stirring the fire. He turned his head slowly. Her eyes were open, watching him. "Good," he said, voice low. He didn't ask for more. She didn't offer it. Later that night, while she slept again, Caleb sat by the hearth sharpening the old knife he used for field dressing. The edge was clean, but he kept running the stone along it. Not because it needed sharpening, because it kept his hands busy. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that Reeve had done this to her, or that no one had stopped him before now. Outside, the snow line crept lower on the mountains. Winter was coming early. He felt it in his bones. But for the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning broke with low clouds and the scent of damp earth. Rain had come in the night, soft but steady, and left the world slick and gray. Caleb moved through the cabin without speaking, bringing in wood, feeding the mare, boiling water. Routine steadied him. He glanced toward the bed every so often. She was awake, eyes open, watching the rafters, unmoving. That was new. He didn't speak, not yet. There was a rhythm to healing, and he'd learned not to rush it. He poured a cup of warm broth and carried it to her. She took it without a word, both hands wrapped around the tin. Her fingers still trembled, but less than before. He turned away, giving her space, moving to the stove to stir the herb poultice. The silence stretched. He didn't mind it. Then, "My name is Eleanor." Her voice was quiet, dry as paper, but clear. Caleb paused, turned. She met his gaze, just for a breath, then looked down into the cup. Her voice didn't shake this time. "Eleanor Harper," he nodded. "Good to know your name, Miss Harper." A small crease touched the edge of her mouth, almost a smile, but not quite, not yet. "I was a clerk," she said, eyes still on the cup. "Land office, just outside Cheyenne. My father ran cattle, died last winter." Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed. She swallowed hard. "They brought in these documents, new deeds, transfers, but they didn't match the originals. Names were wrong, signatures too clean. One of 'em was for a rancher I knew, good man, honest. He said the county claimed he'd sold, but he hadn't." Her eyes lifted, just enough to meet Caleb's again. "I had access, so I checked. Found the old claim, his real signature, the survey lines, everything, and I made copies." Caleb's jaw flexed. He didn't interrupt. "I mailed them to myself," she said. "Different name, general delivery box in Cheyenne. I figured if anything happened, someone could find them." She looked away, her voice dropping.
but they found me first. The rain tapped gently against the windows. The fire popped once. That was the only sound in the room. Eleanor gripped the cup tighter. I didn't tell anyone. Not really. I thought maybe, if I just stayed quiet, they'd let me go. She drew in a breath that caught halfway. They didn't. Caleb stepped forward, not too close, and crouched down beside the bed. His voice was steady. You did the right thing. She shook her head. I was naive. I thought they cared about paper, about law, about proof. They don't, Caleb said, but some of us still do. Eleanor looked at him. This time her gaze didn't slip away. And you? She asked. Caleb hesitated, then said simply, I've lost too much already to let this go. The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence. Something had shifted. Her name was known now. So was her story. And Caleb Whitaker no longer saw a broken woman in his bed. He saw a witness. He saw a spark. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a war worth fighting. By the fourth morning, Eleanor had begun to sit up on her own. She still moved like she was learning her body all over again, but the tremble had faded from her hands, and her voice no longer broke with every word. That was the morning Caleb saddled his mare. I'll be gone a few hours, he said, tightening the cinch. We're low on salt, and I need some binding herbs. Eleanor stood by the porch, blanket draped over her shoulders. Town? He nodded. You think anyone'll talk? Caleb looked off toward the east, where the trail curled between pine and stone. They might, or they might pretend not to see me. He didn't say what she already knew, that the moment he asked the wrong question, he'd be noticed. That Reeve had ears in places most folks didn't even have locks. She didn't stop him, but she watched him ride out until he vanished into the trees. The town of Arbor's Rest hadn't changed much since Caleb last rode through its crooked streets. It still smelled of dust and livestock. The storefronts leaned into the road like tired old men. But there was something else now, a tension under the surface, like stretched wire waiting to snap. Caleb dismounted near the dry goods store. He nodded to the stable hand. The boy looked away. Inside, the shopkeeper, Reynolds, a thin man with spectacles and no spine, greeted him with a forced smile. Whitaker, he said. Didn't think I'd see you back in town. Didn't think I'd need to be, Caleb replied, setting a tin of tobacco and 2 jars of salt on the counter. Heard Malcolm Reeve was in Casper. Reynolds flinched, then looked to the door like someone might be listening. Don't know about that, he said, fumbling with the ledger. I just run a store. Caleb didn't press. He picked up a bottle of rubbing alcohol and placed it beside the salt. You remember Clara? Reynolds' hand paused mid-scribble. Of course. That was a few years back, wasn't it? Caleb nodded. You remember how she died? I heard it was a riding accident near the southern ridge. Funny thing, Caleb said softly. Her horse was trained better than most men I know. Reynolds said nothing. His eyes dropped to the counter. When Caleb stepped out, the wind had shifted. Cooler now, coming from the north. Clouds gathered on the horizon. He stopped by the edge of the street and looked back. 4 men sat outside the saloon, not talking, just watching. One of them tipped his hat, but not as greeting, as warning. Caleb rode back faster than he came. Eleanor met him on the porch. He handed her the salt and herbs, said nothing for a while. Finally, she asked, Bad? They looked through me, he said, like they were already measuring the grave. She didn't blink. So they know? They always have, Caleb said, eyes hardening. They're just waiting to see who's brave enough to say it out loud. Eleanor looked down at the scar on her leg, still red but healing. Then I guess we don't whisper anymore. The fire crackled low, the way it always did when the logs had burned just past their peak.
Outside, the wind whistled against the eaves, but inside the cabin, the world had narrowed to warmth, wood smoke, and two people seated in silence. Eleanor sat curled in the armchair across from the hearth, knees drawn to her chest beneath a wool blanket. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, turning the tin coffee cup in his hands without drinking. Neither had spoken for some time. They didn't need to. Not yet. Then Eleanor broke the silence. "Why didn't you walk away?" She wasn't accusing. Her voice held no judgment. It was a genuine question, one she had probably asked herself about others and about herself. Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched the flames move through the wood, eating slowly. "I have," he said finally, "too many times." Eleanor didn't reply, just waited. He took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "My wife, Clara," he began. "She was the kind that didn't bend easy. Raised on scripture and saddle. Said a man who let injustice sit on his porch was no better than the snake that slivered in." He looked up, his gaze distant. Not lost, remembering. "She found papers, same kind like yours. Old land surveys, rewritten, forged, resold. Reeve had started pushing in on our grazing rights. Clara wasn't one to let a man steal in daylight. She rode into town with proof." Caleb stopped. His jaw worked. He looked at the fire again, then continued. "She never came back." Eleanor's hands curled tighter around her mug. "They said her horse slipped near the ridge, but I know that trail. I rode it blindfolded as a boy. And Clara, she rode better than me." He laughed once, bitter and hollow. "I didn't go after Reeve, not then. I told myself there wasn't proof, that it wouldn't change anything, that maybe it really was an accident." "But you didn't believe it," Eleanor said softly. "No," he admitted. "I just didn't want to be next." A long pause followed. Then Eleanor did something Caleb didn't expect. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his. It wasn't comfort, it was acknowledgement, the kind only two broken people could share. He looked at her, and in her eyes he didn't see pity. He saw understanding, maybe even forgiveness. "You're not running anymore," she said. Caleb shook his head. "No, I'm not." They sat like that for a while, firelight dancing between them, silence speaking louder than words. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled, and the horses shifted in the stable. But inside, something else had shifted. Eleanor wasn't just healing now, and Caleb wasn't just waiting. They were choosing, and choices, he knew, came with consequences. The morning came cold and still, as if the world was holding its breath. Caleb stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, watching a thin mist curl off the pasture. Somewhere beyond the trees, frost clung to the grass in soft silver threads. Winter wasn't far now. Behind him, the cabin creaked gently with Eleanor's movement. She was slower now, but steady. Each step had purpose. Each breath a little stronger. She emerged moments later, wrapped in her shawl, the sleeves of Clara's old blouse rolled to her elbows. Her eyes held a quiet focus, clearer than they had since he'd found her. "I'm going with you." Caleb didn't turn. "With me where?" "To Cheyenne, for the papers." He took a sip, then looked at her. Her gaze didn't waver. "It's not a short ride," he said. 3 days at best, hard trail." "I know." "You're still healing." "I'm not done healing," she said, "but I'm done hiding." He studied her for a moment. There was something steel-hard behind her voice. Not anger, not revenge, just resolve. The kind a man didn't argue with unless he wanted to lose. "What if they're watching the post office?" he asked. "Then they'll see me and know I'm still alive."
Caleb's jaw tensed. That might be what they want. Then let them try again, she said softly, but this time I'm not alone. The words hung there between them, simple and true. He nodded once, slow. Then we ride at first light. The rest of the day passed in quiet preparation. Caleb packed light, jerky, dried apples, coffee grounds, spare ammunition. He wrapped the saddle blankets in oilskin, checked both rifles, sharpened the knives. His motions were practiced, but his chest was tight. Eleanor prepared too, though her way was quieter. She rewound the bandages, packed a small pouch of dried herbs, stitched the torn lining of her coat. At one point, he found her holding a folded scarf, one Clara had worn on stormy days, and wrapping it carefully around her own neck. She didn't say anything, neither did he. That night, they didn't speak much over dinner. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that settled in before a storm. Not fear, but focus. Before dawn, they stood outside, saddle girths tight, breath steaming in the dark. Caleb helped her mount. Her hands were sure, but her legs trembled when the horse shifted. Still, she didn't flinch. "I'll ride slow," he said. "We'll pace it." Eleanor looked eastward, toward the ridge beyond the trees. "No," she said. "Let's ride like we mean it." Caleb gave her a long look. Then he mounted his mare, turned southward, and nudged her forward. They didn't look back. They rode without speaking for the first hour. The only sound the creak of leather and the soft crunch of frost under hooves. The sky above them was an iron gray, the kind that never quite gave way to sun. Pines stood like sentinels along the narrow trail, and every gust of wind felt like it carried secrets. Caleb rode ahead, eyes scanning the ridgelines. Every crow's call made his hand twitch toward the rifle slung at his side. He hated this quiet. It was the kind of silence that remembered things. Eleanor followed, her mare Penny stepping light and obedient. She wore Caleb's old coat, too big for her shoulders, but her spine was straight in the saddle. Every few minutes she adjusted her grip, not from pain, but discipline. He watched her through the corners of his eyes, saw the quiet grit in her face. By noon, they paused by a dry creek bed to water the horses and share a bite of dried meat. Caleb passed her the canteen. "You good?" Eleanor nodded, but he saw the tremble in her hands. "You don't have to talk," he said. She surprised him. "I want to." She stared out over the scrubland. "You ever feel like the land remembers what people forget?" Caleb frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She traced a finger in the dust near her boot. "I passed this way once before," she said, "on a mail cart. Springtime. There were wildflowers. I remember thinking, nothing bad could happen in a place this wide open." Her voice faltered, but not with fear, with clarity. "I know better now." Caleb didn't reply. He just waited. She looked up. "But it's still beautiful." And for a second, he saw her not as the woman in the barn, not as the scarred survivor, but as someone whole, not untouched, but unbroken. They mounted again, the sun slanting low in the sky. That night, they made camp in a clearing between two rocky outcrops. Caleb built a fire from dry pine and brush. Eleanor unpacked the food while he scouted the perimeter. When he returned, she was sitting close to the flames, knife in hand, methodically slicing an apple. "You always that quiet?" she asked, not looking at him. "I talk when I need to." "And now?" Caleb sat beside her, watching the fire flicker. "Now I'm thinking." "About?" He glanced at her, then away. "How a person can look so fragile, but carry enough steel to shame a whole town." Eleanor didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I didn't think I could kill a man," she said, "until I did." Caleb nodded once. "That kind of moment never leaves you, but neither does what it saved." She met his eyes. "You!" He didn't look away. "No," he said, "us." The fire crackled between them. For the first time, Eleanor leaned into the silence, not to escape it, but to settle inside it. Tomorrow, Cheyenne. Tomorrow, danger. But tonight, they were alive. And they were not alone. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Cheyenne wore its dusk like a funeral shawl, gray, quiet, and watching. Caleb and Eleanor dismounted in the alley behind the post office. The town's usual noise was muffled, like even the air knew who might be listening. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter, jaw clenched, but she didn't tremble. Inside, the post clerk, a young man with tired eyes, barely glanced up. Caleb kept his voice even. General delivery, Whitaker. The clerk disappeared through a beaded curtain. The seconds stretched long. Then he returned with a brown envelope, yellowing at the edges, sealed in wax. No questions asked, no names spoken. Caleb handed it to Eleanor. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. She didn't speak, just stepped into the shadows beside a window, cracked the seal, and pulled the contents free. Inside, 6 pages, crisp, carbon-inked. Caleb stepped beside her. Together they read in silence. A deed transferring 160 acres from L. Miller to Malcolm Reeve. Signed in a shaky scrawl, notarized by a clerk no longer alive. A ledger showing land taxes paid 2 years prior but never received by the Miller family. Typed statements from 2 witnesses, ranchers Eleanor had once helped file for. And at the bottom, a list of names. Small-town men with influence. A banker, a deputy, a surveyor. Caleb felt the breath leave him. He'd expected fraud. He hadn't expected this. System. Eleanor spoke first, her voice low but clear. They didn't just steal land, they erased people. He looked at her. Her eyes were bright, not from tears, but from fire. Controlled, contained, but burning deep. We go to Helena, he said. Judge Amos Blackwood's the only one left who can touch Reeve. Eleanor nodded, but didn't move to tuck the pages away. I mailed these to save them, she said softly. Now I wonder if I mailed them to save myself. You did both, Caleb said. She folded the papers, hands firm now, and slid them inside her coat. As she did, the brass bell above the post office door rang out behind them, another customer. Or maybe a warning. Either way, it didn't matter. They stepped out into the cold together. And from that moment, there was no turning back. They stepped out into the evening's chill, the sky over Cheyenne washed in ash blue. Caleb's boots hit the cobblestone with instinctive caution. He scanned the rooftops, the alley's edges. Nothing seemed out of place. But he'd lived too long out west to trust silence when it came too easily. Then, behind them, a shuffle, a click. Don't move. The voice came low and calm, but behind it, metal certainty. Caleb turned slowly. Silas Cain stood 10 feet away, revolver in hand, flanked by 2 others. Shadows in gray coats. One carried a sawed-off. The other, brass knuckles and a smile too wide. "Well, if it ain't the Widowmaker," Silas drawled, eyes flicking to Eleanor. "Thought you were dead, miss." Eleanor didn't answer. Her hand slid, slow and hidden, toward the inside of her coat, toward the folded papers. Silas's gun moved an inch. I wouldn't. Caleb stepped forward. "You really want to do this?" Silas tilted his head. "Don't want to, but Mr. Reeve says unfinished business leaves stains." The man with the sawed-off lifted the barrel. Everything broke in half a second. Caleb grabbed Eleanor, shoved her sideways just as the gun went off. The buckshot tore through the air, missed her head by inches. He pulled his Colt and fired once, striking the brass knuckle man in the leg. The man screamed, stumbled, but Caleb didn't see the second muzzle flash. Pain hit him like lightning, hot, blunt, across the ribs. He fell back, clutching his side, gasping. Eleanor dropped beside him, eyes wild. And then, everything stilled. One of the men lunged toward them. She moved first. The blade was small, Caleb's hunting knife, strapped under her coat. But her hand didn't tremble this time. She drove it upward, into the man's gut, hard and fast. His eyes widened in shock, then went dim. He collapsed beside her. Silas took a step forward, stopped. Eleanor stood now, breath heaving, blood on her hands. Not crying, not broken, just alive. And dangerous. "Go ahead," she said, voice like gravel.
"Try it." Silas stared, weighing the risk. Then he turned. "You're dead anyway," he spat, backing into the dark. "Both of you." They didn't follow. They didn't need to. Caleb groaned. Eleanor dropped beside him again, pressing her scarf to his wound. "I killed him," she whispered. "God, You saved me," Caleb said, jaw tight. "No," she said, more certain now. "I saved us." And in that moment, the scar on her leg stopped being a wound. It became a mark of survival. They ran through back alleys slick with lamp oil and horse dung, breath ragged in the cold. Caleb leaned heavy on Eleanor, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other pressed tight against his ribs. He was bleeding bad. The freight yard lay quiet at the town's edge, where steam hissed from idle locomotives and canvas-covered wagons waited to be hitched. Eleanor spotted one, half filled with crates, unattended, heading west by dusk. She didn't ask permission. She helped him up and over the wagon's side. Caleb grunted, teeth clenched, as he collapsed onto the floorboards. She climbed in after, tugging the canvas down tight, letting them vanish into burlap shadows. Only then did they speak. "Let me see," she said. He shook his head. "Later." They both knew there might not be a later. The wagon lurched forward. Iron wheels clicked against rails. The world outside began to move, but inside the space was still, as if time had paused just long enough to hold them close. Eleanor sat across from him, knees drawn up, hands shaking now, not from cold. She looked at the blood on her sleeve. "I've never killed anyone before," she said. Her voice didn't break. It was hollow, honest. Caleb didn't answer right away. Outside, a whistle blew. Somewhere a conductor called out. But the wagon rolled on, westward, into a dark no one could follow. "You didn't kill to win," he said finally. "You killed to survive." "I didn't even think," she whispered. "I just moved." "That's what living people do." She looked at him then, eyes searching for something, maybe judgment, maybe forgiveness. She didn't find either. What she found was a man bleeding, breathing, and grateful. "I saved us," she said again. It wasn't pride. It was reckoning. "You did," Caleb said, "and that's not something you carry alone." A silence followed, deep and clean. Outside, the train rolled through barren land, black hills silhouetted against moonlight. Inside, beneath canvas and pain, two people sat not as saviors or victims, but as survivors who had chosen, again and again, not to give in. When Caleb finally closed his eyes, Eleanor didn't cry. She just kept watch. Because tonight they were still alive. And sometimes that was enough. The freight wagon let them off a half-mile from the old telegraph station, a forgotten outpost nestled where the prairie met the foothills east of Laramie. The station looked dead from afar, one leaning sign, one lamplight flickering behind dusty glass. But inside, the key still clicked. Jedediah Brooks, grizzled, one-eyed, and loyal to no law but his own, sat behind the desk with a half-smoked cigar and a lever-action rifle by his foot.
When Caleb stepped in, bleeding but upright, Jed raised an eyebrow. "You always show up when I'm out of tobacco." Caleb managed a grin. "Good thing I bring stories instead." Eleanor stood behind him, holding the envelope of documents like it was stitched to her chest. Jed listened as they explained. The deeds, the bribes, the names. "Judge Blackwood," Caleb said.
"In Helena. He's clean. Send these by trusted hand. Don't use wires, and don't put your name on it." Jed didn't ask why. He just nodded. "I got a courier leaving at dawn. He owes me. It'll get there." Caleb dropped into the nearest chair, pain catching up with him. Eleanor pulled bandages from her pouch, kneeling beside him. "Soon as the judge reads those," Jed said, "Reeve'll know he's cornered." Caleb met Eleanor's eyes. "Then we go home," he said. "Not hide, not flee. Go home." The ride back was slow. Caleb's side burned, but he didn't complain. Eleanor rode close. No more questions, just steady presence. They reached the cabin before sundown the next day. Something had changed. The wind had teeth. The sky felt lower. But the land, the cabin, the fence, the firewood stacked under the awning, waited like it had missed them. Inside, they moved with purpose. Eleanor bolted shutters, checked ammunition. Caleb sharpened the axe, loaded both rifles, checked the traps out back. Pain slowed him, but not enough to stop him. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the hearth, the fire low, the silence thick with something unspoken. "You think he'll come?" she asked.
Caleb didn't answer right away. Then, "I'd come." She nodded, no fear in her voice, just truth. Outside, a coyote howled. Inside, two people sat not waiting for rescue, but ready for a reckoning. They came at dawn. No war cries, no galloping hooves, just the slow grind of boots on frost-hardened dirt and the glint of metal through morning fog. 6 men. Malcolm Reeve at the center. He looked just as Eleanor remembered, clean-cut, cold-eyed, wrapped in the kind of coat that screamed power. But this time, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think you'd be foolish enough to come back," he called out. Caleb stood on the porch, rifle across his chest, bandaged but upright. "I came home," he said simply. Eleanor stood behind the window, pistol in hand. Her breath fogged the glass. Steady. Reeve signaled. Gunfire erupted. Wood splintered. The cabin shook. Caleb dropped behind the barrels, returned fire. Calm, practiced. 2 of Reeve's men went down before they even made it past the well. Eleanor moved to flank, circled out the back, silent as wind, crouched behind the barn's side. When one of Reeve's men turned toward the chicken coop, she fired. He dropped. Caleb, bleeding again, saw Reeve move. The man was fast, too fast for a man that smug. He reached the porch, leapt over the railing, and crashed into Caleb. The rifle flew. They rolled in the dirt, fists slamming, boots kicking gravel. Caleb's ribs screamed, but he didn't let go. Reeve straddled him, fist drawn back. "Shoulda stayed a coward," Reeve snarled. Then, a click. Eleanor stood at the edge of the porch, revolver aimed. Her hand trembled, but not from fear. Reeve looked up, smiled. "You won't shoot." Caleb gritted his teeth beneath him. "Don't." But Eleanor stepped closer. "He won't stop," she said, voice flat. It wasn't a plea. It was a judgment. Reeve reached for his gun. Caleb surged upward and slammed his fist into Reeve's throat. The man choked, fell sideways. Caleb pinned him, breathing hard, blood in his mouth. The pistol lay inches away. He looked at it, then looked at Eleanor, and didn't move. Instead, he stood, picked up the gun, and tossed it into the mud. "You're done," he said. Reeve coughed, tried to rise. Behind them, one of the surviving thugs limped away into the trees. No one followed. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not the hush of fear, but the breath of justice just beginning. By mid-morning, the smoke had cleared. 4 bodies lay still beneath frost-bitten grass. The last thug had long since vanished into the trees, taking with him whatever loyalty Reeve had once commanded. Malcolm Reeve groaned as Caleb dragged him across the yard. The man no longer looked like a land baron, just another broken thing, stripped of guns, pride, and name. Caleb dropped him just outside the fence. "You're not buried with good men," he said. Reeve coughed, blood in his teeth. "I'll be back." "No," Eleanor said, standing nearby. "You won't." They buried the dead outside the boundary line, not with reverence, but with order and silence. Caleb hammered a rough wooden post into the earth. No names carved, no prayers spoken, just a marker between what was and what must never return. Eleanor watched the last shovelful of dirt fall. She said nothing, but her hands, once shaking, were steady. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, wrapped in wool blankets, bruises deep beneath the skin. The ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that came after storm. Caleb stared out toward the distant ridge. "Town'll hear about this," he said. "They always do," Eleanor answered. He glanced sideways. "You ready to run again?" She shook her head. "No, we didn't kill them for revenge. We stopped them because we had to." A beat of silence. "Doesn't mean the story's over." He nodded. "No," he said, "but maybe we finally get to choose the next chapter." She looked at him, eyes soft under the setting sun, and for the first time since the barn, since the blood, since the burn, she smiled. A small thing, but true. Later that night, Caleb stood alone by the fence. The grave markers caught moonlight, silent sentinels. He tipped his hat, not in mourning, but in respect. Not for them, but for what had survived. Behind him, Eleanor opened the cabin door. The warmth spilled out. "Come inside," she said. Caleb looked one last time toward the horizon. Then he turned and walked home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The snow had barely begun to melt when they arrived. 3 riders. No posse, no shackles. Just Judge Amos Blackwood in his worn wool coat, flanked by 2 marshals who looked more like tired farmers than men of the law. Caleb was already on the porch, nursing his side. The last logs of the morning fire crackled behind him. Eleanor met them at the gate. There were no greetings, no questions, just a mutual understanding. They weren't here for arrest. They were here for truth. Inside, the fire popped gently. Blackwood removed his gloves, placed a small leather-bound notebook on the table. "Let's talk," he said simply. They sat close, not from fear, but from the kind of stillness that only comes after long nights and longer reckonings. Eleanor poured coffee. Her hands didn't shake. Caleb leaned forward. "We have the deeds. We have names, witness accounts." Blackwood nodded. "I read the courier's file. Half the town's whispering now. Reeve's hold is slipping." "Whispers won't be enough," Eleanor said. "He had judges in his pocket." "He did," Blackwood agreed, "but not all of them." One of the marshals reached for the envelope. "This," he said softly, "might actually be enough." Silence again. Then, "What do you want us to do?" Caleb asked. Blackwood looked up. "I want you to heal. I want her to be safe. And I want that land to stay in honest hands." He opened the notebook, scribbled something, tore a small page out. "Helena Court wants your official statement, Eleanor. They'll pay for lodging. More if you want a job. Records department." Eleanor took the paper, looked at it for a long time, then folded it, tucked it in her coat. "Not yet," she said. "There's too much fence to mend here." Blackwood didn't press. He knew what healing looked like. It rarely started in courtrooms. They stayed through lunch. No more questions, just slow conversation, laughter once or twice, and the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but earned. Before they left, one marshal looked back toward the house. "You two holding this place together?" Caleb nodded. Eleanor smiled faintly. Piece by piece. As the horses faded down the ridge, Eleanor sat by the fire. She didn't speak, didn't have to. Caleb reached over, laid his hand over hers. The storm had passed. The wounds would scar. But tonight, for the first time, they belonged to a land that was listening. And in that stillness, justice had finally knocked. Not with fury, but with a warm cup of coffee and a quiet place to sit.
Winter passed like an old man's breath, slow, quiet, and full of memory. Caleb rebuilt the eastern fence with one good hand and a mouthful of curses. Eleanor patched the barn roof, her stitches tighter than any canvas seam. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing they needed to explain. Eleanor left for Helena in mid-January. She took the statement Judge Blackwood gave her, took the parcel of deeds and names, took the truth that had nearly killed her, and handed it to the courts that had once ignored women like her. Caleb stood at the gate as she rode out. "I'll be back," she promised. "You'd better." When she returned, March was warming the ground. Her coat was thinner, her face sharper, but her eyes were steady. She dismounted, walked up to the porch without a word. Caleb met her at the steps. "Well?" he asked. "Ah," she exhaled, slow. "The case is moving. Reeves' influence is done. They've opened proceedings against half a dozen officials tied to the land thefts." "You testify?" "Twice." He looked at her, full of things he didn't know how to ask. "I stayed in the room the whole time," she added.
"Didn't flinch once." Caleb smiled. "Good," he said. "That's good." Spring came slow but sure. The river swelled. The earth softened. The birds returned, tentatively, as if checking whether the land was worth trusting again. One morning they climbed the ridge behind the cabin. It was Eleanor's idea. They stood on the high ground where the wind moved softer than it used to, like it too had settled. Below them, the ranch sprawled out in all its rough, worn glory. A home not because it was perfect, but because they'd bled to hold it. Caleb glanced sideways. "We could build something up here someday, a second cabin or a garden." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She just looked at the land, at him, at herself, not the scars, but the shape of her own becoming. Then she said, quiet but certain, "We already have." The words hung in the wind like prayer, not shouted, but understood. And in that moment they weren't fugitives, weren't victims, weren't even lovers in the classic sense. They were builders, of fences, of silence, of something steady enough to be called peace. And that, perhaps, was the most radical kind of justice, the kind you stay to grow. Stay for the silence, return for the truth. Discover Western Heart's Love in the Dust, a series where every glance, every scar, and every quiet goodbye echoes stories of grace, redemption, and the kind of love that lingers like a hymn. Because some loves are built, not declared.